Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It's another beautiful late spring day here in the Pacific Northwest. Let's jump into this forest. Let's see what we see. And take a look just under this fern. We've got a whole entire cluster of a plant that I love to see that I don't bump into all that often. Take a look. This is what's commonly referred to as Heartleaf Twayblade, Neottia cordata. And this is one of those just incredible orchids. So you'll notice that it's got this classic kind of orchid-looking flower that's going to have a unique bottom lobe. We call that the lip. And that's going to serve as a platform for pollinating insects. Now, one thing that's unique about this one, aside from these opposite heart-shaped leaves down here, is that it's going to have a relatively unpleasant smell. And this is used to attract different insects. Specifically, this one, among other things, it tends to attract fungus gnats. And some of you may realize that these developed flowers are really specialized. So they're going to use these glues to affix pollen in a viscous fluid to all these insects that pass by. And interesting that this one uses those fungus gnats. And notice those heart-shaped leaves. Up here we've got flowers that are a little further along, so these have that maroonish color, and you can really see clearly on these that Y-shaped bottom lobe or petal. So really unique. Now, in spite of the fact that the flowers are super developed, the roots are not. So these are known, orchids in general, for tapping into these fungal networks, the hyphae that exist underneath the surface. And here's a younger one. You can see those flowers just developing, still that bright spring yellowish green, and then giving way to the reds and the maroons. Boy, such a pleasure bumping into these guys out here. And cool to think about the different roles that they're playing. Anytime I bump into these orchids or other mycoheterotrophic plants out here, I always use that as somewhat of an indicator that, hey, I'm in a really rich fungal ecosystem that's got a lot of diversity at play, whether I see it or not. And I just hopped off trail real quick to a very welcome site at the forest edge. Check this out. This is what's commonly referred to as the Prince, Agaricus augustus. And this is a mushroom that is considered to be one of the most delicious mushrooms out there. In fact, some people consider it the most delicious wild edible mushroom that you'll encounter. This one even graces the cover of David Aurora's famous book, Mushrooms Demystified. And this is not particularly one that I'm on the lookout for in the forest, but more so in areas just like this, on the forest edges or suburban environments. Notice down here at the base, we've got a shaggy stipe down low, and then up near the cap, it may get a little smoother. We see an intact partial veil. If I kind of open this up a little bit, we'll notice underneath, we've got white free gills. So, and then on the outside, we've got these golden scales, but those free gills that we're seeing down underneath there, those will begin white, and then they'll transition to a pinkish, and then a chocolate brown color with maturity. And if I try to tear this stipe off, you'll notice that it's going to break clean from the cap. That's a classic feature of Agaricus mushrooms, similar to the white button mushroom or the portobello that you may purchase at the store. And that's because these ones are related. So this is in that same Agaricus genus. So notice we've got white free gills, golden scaly cap. Look at this yellow staining on the stipe here. This will oftentimes show up on the margin of the cap as well. And in more mature specimens, you know, that intact partial veil will break free and it'll leave a skirt or an annulus on that stipe that's oftentimes very pronounced. And here's a good look at those kind of golden brown scales. You can see the cap on this one is dried out a little bit. That'll oftentimes happen with these. So if there's no moisture, the cap will oftentimes dry out and crack a bit. And here's more over here. I'm glad that these are still here. I was actually out on a run yesterday when I first spotted these, and I figured I'd come back and check them out, and lo and behold, they're still here. Now I will mention that even though that partial veil is still intact, notice how the cap is all kind of dried out and cracked. As I mentioned, that's kind of distinctive for these, but I can also tell that the bugs have started to hit these. These are a favorite amongst those pill bugs. So probably had I foraged it yesterday, would have been a little bit more of a treat to take home and cook up. But I should also reference that one of the key characteristics for these guys has to do with the aroma. So these have a very, very strong almond or marzipan aroma. And that's one of the hallmark features of this that makes it relatively easy to identify. These ones love the heat. So as we get into these hotter June, July, August months, keep your eye out for these guys because they're sure to pop up. Just be mindful to steer clear of busy roads or industrial areas because these have a tendency to accumulate heavy metals like mercury and cadmium. And take a look down here. I'm super excited to stumble across this black cup fungus. Take a look at this. So if you've been watching this channel a while, you know that these black cup fungi can be notoriously difficult to identify down to species here in the Pacific Northwest because we have so many different ones that look so similar. But this one is different. Take a close look here. Do you see those orangish granules around the outer edge of the cup and on the underside? That helps us to narrow this down to the Plectania genus, either Plectania melastoma or Plectania harnischii, one of the two. And to make a definitive call on that, I'd really have to get this under a microscope to look at the spores and compare those to one another. But very cool to be able to narrow it down to Plectania. And boy, I tell ya, I'm getting distracted by the spider web. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if this spider has actually strategically placed its web just above these cups to catch insects that may be going after the fungus. Let me know on the off chance if this is something that you've observed out in the field, these spiders kind of strategically working with the fungi. I always think it's interesting to see the interplay between a lot of these insects and spiders and different mushrooms that are out here. Super cool to see. And what a beautiful mushroom this is. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over so that you can see what this looks like on the underside of this cup. And again, notice those really distinctive orangish granules on the underside and around that rim. So that's going to be most distinctive on these Plectania cups at younger ages. So, if these are weathered or experience a little bit of rain, it's possible that that could be washed away. So not seeing those doesn't necessarily rule these Plectania species out, these two that I'm pinpointing, but it certainly narrows them down to them when you do or are able to observe them, at least to my knowledge. In zooming out from these cup fungi, there's something catching my eye over here, just on the other side of this log. Do you see that dried out, kind of dark brown stalk over there? That's the dried last year's flower from Pinesap. So this is one of our mycoheterotrophic plants that loves this little mossy patch of forest. And if we look closely, check this out, right down here. Isn't this amazing? So this is just the beginning of, again, what we refer to generally as Pinesap. This is Monotropa hypopitys. And this is, of course, in the same genus currently as ghost pipe or Indian pipe, which was a plant that we featured relatively recently in a video maybe about a month back. This is one of those rare mycoheterotrophic plants. And one of the things that's really interesting about these orchids and heath plants, in the Agaricus family, is a lot of times they'll be really specific about their fungal partners. So this specific one, the Pinesap, really is specific about pairing with Tricholoma genus of mushrooms. So, here's another one. Check this out. This is last year's flower. So you can see the little seed head where the flower used to be. That'll contain just a plethora of the tiniest little seeds. Looks like we've got a little Nolania down there as well. But, these mycoheterotrophic plants, again, similar to what I was saying about the orchids, when you're finding these, you're in a really great fungal ecosystem because these are partnering with these mycelial networks underneath the ground. Here's a couple more just popping up. And if I remember to do this when I'm editing it, I'll go ahead and throw a couple photos in from last year's once they kind of pop above ground. They're just a real stunner, an absolutely beautiful plant. One of my favorites to encounter out here, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. And check out this colorful little guy. This is the red Net-Winged Beetle. And this eats slime molds and fungi, among other things. And its bright colors warn potential predators that it's toxic. And moving just up the trail here, in and amongst the salal, take a look at what we've got here. Boy, we're really getting lucky with the plants today. So this is what's typically referred to as the Vancouver ground cone, Kopsiopsis hookeri. It also goes by other common names like small ground cone or hooker's ground cone, but you can see where it gets its name. So it almost looks like a Doug fir cone that's just popping straight out of the ground here. And similar to some of these other mycoheterotrophic plants that we've looked at today, this one lacks chlorophyll, so it's actually tapping into the root system. See that one back there? As I poke around here, I'm seeing more and more. Now this is one that I don't see that often, and so anytime that I do, I always stop to check it out. Look at this. Isn't that wild? So it's pretty much exactly the same size as a Douglas fir cone. And again, you can certainly see how it gets its name. Now, there's a little bit of debate whether this is, any given time that you bump into this, whether it's tapping directly into the root system of the salal via Haustoria, or whether it's kind of partnering with associated fungus through these mycelial networks. Either way, there's a lot of research that suggests that this is most often working directly with the salal. And so, as I zoom out and we look around here, that's clearly the ground cover out here is salal. And for those of you out here in the Pacific Northwest, salal is everywhere. But I will say this plant is certainly not. Again, this is not one that I typically bump into. And, this will actually have like a starchy kind of base at the root that was sometimes eaten raw by native peoples. And other coastal groups, I believe in the central kind of coast of BC, thought this to be a good luck charm. I certainly always feel that way. Every time I bump into this, I feel it's a lucky day. And just up the trail here, we were just recently discussing the Vancouver ground cone and good luck. Here's another thing that is reportedly good luck. We've got a 4-leaved Trillium. We see 4 sepals there, 4 leaves. Looks like the flower on this may have only had 3 petals. Perhaps there was a 4th petal that fell off. But up until this spring, I had never encountered a 4-leaf Trillium. As I'm sure many of you know, they typically come in 3s. 3 leaves, 3 sepals, 3 flower petals, just like you see out front here. But earlier this April, I encountered the first one that I'd ever seen while out on a run with a buddy. This is a more typical one back here. You can see these flowers are on their way out, but we can see the typical 3-petal, 3-sepal, 3-leaf Trillium, which is standard out here. But these 4-leaf Trilliums, this is the second one that I've seen this year and the second one that I've seen in my life. So another sign of good luck out here. Let me know if you've been encountering these this season. And just up here, growing from the side of this log, we've got a familiar sight. This is the spring growth of the red-belted conch, Fomitopsis mounceae. And notice that it's all just kind of covered with these beads of getacean. So this is a very common sight here with the red-belted conch, and other shelf fungi will do this as well, oftentimes during periods of rapid growth. So especially when we get significant temperature swings, these fruit bodies will just bead up with an abundance of these metabolites. So this is sort of like the sweat of the mushroom. So we can think of it as perspiring. But there's a lot of really interesting theories about potential bioactive compounds contained within these metabolites, these beads of getacean. And I remember years back hearing Paul Stamets theorize that potentially bees and other insects, he theorized, may be using these as a way of enhancing their immune function or their immune systems. So I haven't heard one way or the other. I don't know that there's been adequate research on that, but an interesting theory at the very least. And even if, say that these insects are hitting up these beads of getacean strictly as a water source. So let's just suppose for a second that there are no bioactive compounds that are benefiting their immune health. It's still fascinating. And look, right down here, we've got some insect activity as we speak. And those, I constantly observe insects either sipping off of these drops or even swimming through them on occasion. I've seen that with various mushroom types. And, I think that in and of itself is fascinating. If this is a water source for insects in the forest. I've been known to quench my own thirst on runs out here off of this red-belted conch getacean. If you haven't given it a try, consider licking a red-belted conch. Let me know what you think if you've ever done that. But fascinating to see out here, and always something that I take time to pause, to admire, and to appreciate. A real work of beauty out here in the forest. And boy, this time of year, the plant life is just amazing. Check it out. We've got one that we've talked about or discussed before. This is sweet Cicely. And then right next to it, we've got cleavers, which we've also talked about in videos past. Highly medicinal, edible green that kind of clings to your fingers or clothes, a bit like Velcro. Really cool plant. And of course, a little bit of Siberian miner's lettuce mixed in there. Just an abundance. And let's look back over real quick here at this sweet Cicely. So this is, of course, in the parsley or carrot family. So it's not one that I typically recommend people to forage, just for the simple fact that you really have to be dialed in. There are some deadly toxic family members that kind of could look similar. However, even if you're not going to forage this one for consumption, which I will mention that the roots and the leaves and the seeds are all edible, but even if you're not kind of feeling adventurous, what I would say is if you see this one and you're wondering if it is sweet Cicely, go ahead and snag some of these seeds, crush them up, and give them a little sniff test. See if they smell like black licorice or anise. And here's a good look at some of these green young seeds developing on the sweet Cicely. I'll oftentimes grab some of these while I'm on the trail, whether it's just to sniff or nibble on them, a nice little trailside plant to have on your radar. And check this out. Here's a perfect example of a little sweet Cicely plant that's displaying all different stages. Take a look at this. Here are these subtle little white flowers, very easy to miss and very fleeting. They're here one day, gone the next. But those will, of course, develop into those green seed pods that we were looking at a second ago. And in fact, if I cast my gaze a little higher up here, you can see some of those green seed pods hanging out. Let me see if I can get those back into focus here. a great trailside plant, very fragrant, very tasty. And even though I see this one often out here, I had to pause to just admire this. This is our Western Panther Cap, Amanita panthernoides. This one of our toxic mushrooms, especially high in ibotenic acid and muscimol. I've actually read that these darker brown variations are actually a lot higher in ibotenic acid than, say, Amanita muscaria. But what a beautiful mushroom to encounter any time of year out here. Look at that. And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got one of our native roses. This one a little smaller, a little less showy than the Nootka rose. This is the bald hip rose. In this one, just a beautiful little forest-dwelling plant. Oftentimes you'll see this in association with things like Oregon grape and salal and huckleberry. But the reason I pulled over is not necessarily to discuss this plant, but more so to investigate this bright orange blotch here on the stem. Let me see if I can get this in focus here. So a lot of these native roses are somewhat susceptible to this fungal parasite. Let's zoom in and take a look. So the bald hip rose has these doubly serrated little leaflets. And take a look at this. So just as is the case with a lot of roses, these are susceptible to these rose rusts. I'm not sure of exactly what species this is, but it's safe to say that it's likely in the Phragmidium genus. And notice, you can see some of the orange spores kicked off on the stem and on the leaves. See a couple of those straight thorns of that bald hip rose poking out of that. Isn't that interesting how it just makes that little mass? If I rub this with my fingers here, let's see if we can kind of get an indication of those spores coming off. Yeah, look at that. Staining my fingers there. So if you're a gardener, you may be well aware of these rose rusts, and I'm not sure exactly why this family of plant is so susceptible to these different fungal parasites, but it's certainly the case, and that applies not just to the ones in the garden, but also those that exist or reside out here wild in the local forests. So keep an eye out for those. Definitely an interesting thing to observe. And take a look just up here. This is pretty interesting. So we've got what looks to be a red alder that fell over in last fall's windstorms. We've got a little miner's lettuce here, Claytonia siberica. Again, edible green, high in vitamin C. It's called this, its new home, no problems here. But what really caught my eye are these two things over here. So we've got the sulfur tuft, Hypholoma fasciculare, a common mushroom growing from dead wood. And we've also got dog vomit slime mold. Look at how vibrant that is. That was what really caught my eye. This one over here, again, a toxic mushroom. I'm sure several of you remember me hitting that with a UV flashlight. This one will really light up a neon green, sort of an eerie neon green color. I see another little cluster hiding over there in the recesses. These sulfur tufts tend to fruit in relative abundance both in the spring and the fall. And look underneath, you can see a little bit of almost like a highlighter yellow. Again, that's going to glow a neon green in UV light. And so always fun to bump into this one any time of year, but you definitely don't want to confuse it with its edible counterpart that grows on conifer wood, Hypholoma capnoides. And you know, I always love this time of year when you can see this stark contrast between the spring green new growth of the salal contrasted against the darker, older growth. I always love just kind of peeking in at that. Same thing goes here for this western hemlock. This is a favorite for teas. The secret when you're making teas out of the fresh spring growth or spring tips of all these different conifers, which oftentimes people will do this with Douglas fir or spruce or western hemlock. The key is to not boil it. So to just steep it in warm water, but not boiling water. That'll keep it from getting bitter. And it's got a wonderful citrusy, foresty flavor. Very high in vitamin C. So that's definitely a treat as well this time of year. And take a look down here. Boy, we are really lucking out with the plants today. So this is what's known as white-veined wintergreen, Pyrola picta. And notice it's got this nice flower stalk. Those haven't bloomed yet. But notice too, it's got these white-veined leaves, hence the name. And you know, this is a really interesting plant because similar to the Heartleaf Twayblade, it's got leaves that display photosynthetic capabilities, but it's also a mycoheterotrophic plant, especially in that seedling stage. And this one is one that's not super common out here, but it oftentimes grows in association with salal. These are both members of the Agaricus family, and they like similar conditions. So this is just one of those plants that I always love seeing. And the proper term for this, we say that it's mixotrophic. So in that seedling stage, it's heavily reliant on mycorrhizal fungi and tapping into those mycelial networks. But then it also has these photosynthetic capabilities. Isn't that beautiful? And just down here, we've got a really cool plant that's easily overlooked. This is what's commonly referred to as Fringe Cup. And if we take a look down here at these basal leaves, we can see they're roughly heart-shaped with kind of serrated or toothed edges. They're also going to be really furry or hairy. And we can see that that applies not just to the stem, but also the upper surface of the leaf, as well as if we peek underneath, the bottom is also going to be quite hairy or furry to the touch. And if we drift our attention up here to the actual flowers, notice you can see how they get their name. So they're sort of cup-shaped, and they've got these really delicate, fringy patterns that are beautiful in their own right. Again, really easy to miss. But I'd encourage you to zoom in and take a look. They'll start out kind of a whitish, greenish color, but with age, they'll turn magenta or reddish in color even. So I'd encourage you to pause, check this one out. And just up here, this is a great example of how this Fringe Cup can form these dense colonies along the trails out here. So keep an eye out for this. And you know, it's rumored that woodland elves would use this to improve their night vision. While I can attest to that, I will say that a lot of indigenous tribes would pound this and boil it into a tea that was viewed somewhat as a cure-all for virtually any sickness. And just up here, we've got another one of my favorite springtime wildflowers. This is what's commonly referred to as the Western Trumpet honeysuckle. Sometimes it's just simply referred to as orange honeysuckle. But take a look at this flower. Isn't that beautiful? And we can see that really unique leaf pattern where it's like a split leaf that this kind of fruits out of, all up that kind of viney growth. And this is one of those ones that, you know, a lot of you as kids may have kind of gone off after these particular flowers for that sweet, kind of sugary nectar at the base of these flowers. Now these will also produce kind of an orangish berry that's widely regarded as being inedible. But you know, this viney growth, I'm told, was oftentimes used for like weaving or lashing by a lot of the indigenous peoples. And you know, it's not just one of my favorite plants, it's also one of the favorite plants of the rufous hummingbird, which I just heard in the background. I'm not sure if the mic picked it up or not, but what a beauty, right? And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got a common trailside plant. Down here we've got a starflower, lacking a flower. But the one that I really wanted to look at was this bigger one. that's standing several feet high. This is one that's actually non-native, so this is an introduced plant that escaped from, I believe, northern Europe. This is what's commonly referred to as wall lettuce, and it's gone through some taxonomic changes. I believe the genus of this one has changed recently, but it's an interesting plant that's really common in our Douglas fir forests, and you'll see it along these trail sides. So it's done really well out here, and you'll notice it's got these deeply lobed leaves, and it's also got an interesting attachment. Here's another interesting feature. If you tear the leaf, you'll notice that it's got this kind of milky, it exudes this milky white substance. So this is actually related to kind of our garden lettuce plants. And just as is the case with our garden lettuce, this is an edible green, but I should add that it's relatively bitter. So I don't know of anyone who has this at the top of their foraging list, but it's just good to know because it's super common out here. Even though it's non-native, it's well established. You're definitely going to see it if you're hiking the trails of the Pacific Northwest, especially in these Doug fir forests. So it's just another one that it's nice to know your neighbors and to have an idea of what they're doing out here. So even though, these bitter greens, I always think of them as being really healthy and good for us. But I tend to, if I am going to munch on that one, I try to harvest it when it's relatively young and a little less bitter than it would likely be right now. But this one, I know that a lot of times people will seek out a prickly lettuce that was once placed in the same genus. I don't know that that's still the case, but that particular one that has some similarities was oftentimes used in different treatments as a pain reliever. So I'm not sure if this one has similar medicinal capabilities or not. I know that it's an edible plant, but I'll have to look this up in greater detail when I get back and just kind of freshen up on the particulars. But just figured I'd pause and point it out because, this time of year, this is one that I see quite often out here in the Pacific Northwest. Again, that's wall lettuce. And boy, one thing that I've really noticed this spring as I've been out wandering around the forests of the Pacific Northwest is that it's feeling a little dry out here. Seems like, there's some concerns over snowpack and just general moisture. I know that we're not at an extreme point, but I have heard that we're officially in what they categorize as a D1 drought in much of western Washington here this year. So it'll be interesting to see. And as I reach down, check this out. I mean, that's just bone dry, this moss. And sure, we've gotten a few rains here and there. We've still got some mushrooms and we've got plant activity and all this stuff, but it's feeling a little bit more parched than I feel like it should be this time of year. So we'll have to see what the season brings. As I glance at my weather tracker, it looks like there may be some rain in the forecast for next week, which, boy, we could really use it. When conditions are like this in the spring, I tend to get a little nervous about, later summer. Some of these years we've had what we are terming the smoke season. So even though I love burn morels, I'd love to avoid the smoke season if we can. We'll see what happens. And boy, I tell you, this year I've been really especially enjoying the salmon berries. They can really vary quite a bit in their taste and even their look from bush to bush. It can really vary, but these are an excellent source of vitamin C and provitamin A, antioxidants. They're anti-inflammatory, and I always like to think that they're good for gut health and microflora as well. So a high source of dietary fiber and phenolic compounds, all of which does the body good. So dig into some of these if you have passed them by recently on your recent jaunts out on these Pacific Northwest trails. They're waiting for you. And check this out. So I just bumped back out to the forest edge under these Doug firs, and look what we've got here. So we've got a slippery jack. This is in the Swillis genus, And boy, I tell you what, this is not a mushroom that I was expecting to encounter today. I think of these as coming up in the fall time, but not so much the spring. And as I investigate this too, so there's a couple contenders, right? And that would be the fat jack, which is Swillus caronescens, or the matte jack, which is Swillus lakei. And this one, I believe, is the fat jack, Swillus caronescens. And let's kind of take a closer look at some of these key characteristics. So we've got this uniquely pored surface. So this is obviously in the bolete family. So, you're not going to see gills under this. Instead, you're going to see a pored surface. Look up here too, near the stipe. See that bluing that's taking place? So that's happening on what appears to be a white inner flesh. We're getting a bluing result. You can also see remnants of a partial veil. You can see the texture of that cap. I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and give this another cut here. I'm gonna let that do its thing. I'm kind of curious to see how this bluing continues or persists. But take a look at that flesh on the inside. So if this were Swillus lakei, I would expect that interior flesh to be a little more rosy than white. I'll give you another close look here at that sponge layer. Interesting to see. And take a look. So both of these will have a little bit of bluing near the base at the stipe. So that doesn't necessarily pin down one or the other. But what I will say is that that whiter inner flesh is more characteristic of the fat jack, as is the deep blue that I'm seeing in that color. So a lot of times when Swillus lakei will do its bluing, it may be a little more greenish than that deep dark blue. So aside from that, also the cap to me looks more like the fat jack than it does the matte jack. So let me know if you're looking at that and you have a different opinion. But super interesting to see this one poking its head out in the spring. And look at this, lo and behold, more examples of our friend the prince, Agaricus augustus, one of the true treats of summer mushrooms out here in the Pacific Northwest. Take a look. Got similar dry cracking pattern up here on these caps, but still great to see this one. Definitely keep your eyes peeled. Again, let's take a quick look underneath. I know we talked about this earlier, but a quick little review. We've got that scruffy, shaggy stipe, a little smoother up near the cap, remnants of a partial veil, and perhaps most distinctive, aside from the golden scales on the cap, we've got that wonderful almond aroma. It is so distinctive for this one, and one of the hallmarks that makes it a real treat or treasure to find out here. So keep your eyes peeled for this one. If you're new to the channel and you haven't seen the video that I put out specifically on the prints, we get into a lot of the specifics around this one. We talk about the way that they're related to common button and portobello mushrooms, characteristics of the Agaricus mushrooms, a little bit of history, and a whole lot more. So I'll link that video here so that if you haven't seen it, you can check it out. Otherwise, until next time, happy trails.